Good morning, Hank. It's Tuesday. Last week I was on Capitol Hill with hundreds of TB fighters from our community, meeting with over 250 Senate and congressional offices to discuss global health and tuberculosis funding and research. And while I was there, a bunch of congressional staffers asked me, is Hank gonna run? At first I thought they were sort of kidding, but then it kept happening throughout the day until eventually I realized these people seriously want internet sensation Hank Green to be a congressperson. And then I started to wonder, should Hank Green be a congressperson? Now, this is not an entirely irrelevant discussion, Hank, because also last week, two of your elected representatives, both your congressperson and one of your senators, unexpectedly retired. Meaning that, it's possible. Now, firstly, Hank, let me just address my own situation. I cannot run for public office for two reasons. First, because I would hate it. The first 6 years of my career, I worked at a magazine called Booklist, where we had, thanks to the genius of my publisher, Bill Ott, exactly one meeting per year. And that was the right number of meetings for me. Whereas I can tell, just from the meetings I had last week with congresspeople and senators, that their job is essentially meetings. And I hate meetings. I hate them with a passion that burns with the fire of 1,000 suns. Also, I hate asking people for money, especially if it's money for my own political ads. I also hate confrontation and I hate small talk. But in addition to hating the job, I would also be terrible at it. It's all about team building and extroversion and coalitions, none of which fall into my fundamental skill set of sitting in the basement alone with my imagination. But you, Hank, you're an extrovert. You're a team builder. You can manage people. You have a high capacity for work, especially when it's meaningful work. Also, like any good politician, you love to tweet. Now, I would say some of your old tweets might be disqualifying, but it turns out that no tweets are disqualifying. Now, admittedly, you don't own a suit and you have no known political ambitions, but I would argue those might actually be assets in Montana. And I'll confess something to you, Hank, which is that I kind of want a brother who's in Congress. Now, you know how, people say you don't want to own a boat, you want a friend with a boat? This is how I feel about Congress. I don't want to be a congressperson, but I wouldn't mind having a brother who's a congressperson. Think of the legislation I could make him co-sponsor. I think you'd be pretty good at the job. They could use a science communicator and global health advocate in Congress. Plus, the YouTube to Senate pipeline is relatively underdeveloped, and you do love blazing a trail, Hank. But then there are other considerations where I'm like, well, maybe Hank shouldn't run for Congress. For one thing, you already have a very important job, which is being my brother. Being my brother is rather time-consuming. You have to pick up the phone essentially anytime I call and listen to me complain for hours, and would you still have time to do that if you were in the Senate? And that's not even to mention your non-fraternal jobs. I mean, how are you going to start a new podcast every 8 weeks when you're also in Congress? Also, and most importantly, it might be bad for Vlogbrothers. Whenever we're making a big decision about our professional lives, the first question is always, but would this be bad for Vlogbrothers? And if it would be, then we don't do it. And I do worry that you being a congressperson might be bad for Vlogbrothers. The vibes are pretty good in comments these days, and I feel like the mods would have a lot more work if you were a congressperson. But on the other hand, we do need people who can communicate well and are passionate and empathetic in leadership positions. I know public service has had a bad rep for some time in the United States. It was 150 years ago that Mark Twain quipped, "There is no native criminal class in the United States except Congress." But when I was on Capitol Hill last week, I kept being reminded that the idea of public service is noble, even if much of what happens in Washington definitely is not. All of which is just to say that if you run for office, Hank, I will support you 100%, albeit with some misgivings. And really, that's always how I support politicians, with some misgivings. I mean, by definition, they're a little too ambitious for my tastes. Although, so am I. At any rate, Hank, I'd let the folks in congressional offices know that you probably won't be running for Congress. You're too busy making Hank's channel videos about weird fish and co-creating apps that help me focus and so on. Also, there's an additional issue, which is that both of these Montana politicians waited until just before the candidacy filing deadline to announce their retirements, essentially allowing them to, hand-pick their successor. And so you actually can't run because you didn't file the relevant paperwork. Another reminder that the machinery of our democracy certainly can be misused. I'll be honest, Hank, when I was in Washington, I saw a lot to be discouraged about. I mean, a branch of our government that legally cannot start wars nonetheless just started one. Congress, which is supposed to decide if and when we go to war and also how government money gets spent, is doing not nearly enough of either of those jobs. But when I look at the TB fighters and what they accomplished last week and what they accomplish every week, and when I look at Nerdfighteria in general, I begin to see how real change, positive change, can happen even amid corrupt systems. Like, since the year 2000, about 70 million deaths from tuberculosis have been averted through a mix of lowering the incidence rate and increasing treatment and cure rates. That progress is absolutely insufficient. Nobody should die of tuberculosis, but it is still 70 million people who lived a longer and healthier life because they did not die of tuberculosis. And yeah, elected officials have something to do with that, but so does the quiet, often exhausting work of activists. Like, I think about this TB fighter named Tofu who designed a brilliant website that tells you who your elected leaders are and whether they signed on to these really important Dear Colleague letters about global health and tuberculosis funding. And like, getting people to sign these Dear Colleague letters has been incredibly effective. Like, it's unclear how or whether the administration will actually spend the money that Congress appropriated, but global health funding and tuberculosis funding are both relatively flat from the Biden years. So like, if the Constitution works, and yes, I never thought I'd need that dependent clause, but here we are, we will actually continue to fund tuberculosis and global health in general at about the same rate we've been funding it, which is a huge win. And this tool made by Tofu has allowed people to make much more specific and actionable requests of their congresspeople, which really makes a difference. Like, my congressman signed on to these Dear Colleague letters after I reached out. And so yeah, by all means, run for office if you can, but also remember, running for office is not the only form of public service. Like, Tofu's website is a public service. So Hank, there are many forms of public service, and I expect that you will pursue many of them in the coming years, even though you will not be the next congressperson or senator from the great state of Montana. Although, as I told several people when they asked me about it on Capitol Hill, when it comes to Hank Green, you can never rule anything out. Hank, I'll see you on Friday.